Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski. Welcome to another Cipher Brief conversation. We're talking today, as are a lot of people these days, about TikTok. The ban that has been proposed has gone all the way up to the Supreme Court. A long-running conversation about whether that ban should go through, and in particular, the future of TikTok as long as it is owned, as it is now, by a Chinese company. We're joined today by Cipher Brief expert Glenn Gerstell. Good to see you, Glenn, a longtime expert in international law, global communications, among other things. And Glenn, first of all, I guess let's just start with a core step-back question, which comes up in all these conversations. Do you believe that the app TikTok, given its Chinese ownership, poses a risk to U.S. national security?
Thanks, Tom. And yes, I do. That's the short answer. The longer answer is there's no question but that the PRC government and the Chinese Communist Party are interested in doing extensive surveillance in the United States, in possibly disrupting our lives through cyber maliciousness. And I don't think there's any doubt that on some level, at least, China presents a significant and serious national security risk. I don't think anyone's debating that. The question of how that could be manifest through an app that is owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, which I might add, as American investors, institutional investors, is a big part of it, but nonetheless, it's a Chinese company. The question of how ByteDance might be required to respond to Chinese law, in particular the Chinese national security law, and either hand over data about Americans that was collected on the app, or possibly covertly influence the content on the app. That's the question. That's the risk that has been identified by national security officials as relevant to the TikTok app.
And do you think that's a legitimate risk, that they would mine this stuff for all those reasons you just outlined?
So I definitely think it's a risk. I should be clear that there's been no showing that that risk has materialized. The government, even in the most recent case, hasn't said that China has not said that China has already sought to manipulate data on the TikTok platform, nor is there any showing that Americans' data has been siphoned off to Beijing, so to speak. But there is that potential, and of course, that's what this law is aimed at. This law is aimed at trying to eliminate that potential. It doesn't, even if the law was fully in effect, and we could talk about this more in the program, it's not clear to me that it would actually 100% achieve its goals, but that's the goal of the statute.
And just to drill down a little bit more on, before we get to those other points, on how the nefariousness, if you will, would work. As I understand it, so they're hoovering up the Chinese authorities, regime, whatever you want to call it, lots and lots and lots of data about us, about teenagers, about whoever's using TikTok. And they could use that for manipulative purposes, for other purposes. Talk a little, and disinformation has come up a lot too. What's the, I guess, not worst case, but the scenario that should make us nervous? Because a lot of people have been a bit flip about, well, what are you going to do with young people looking at stuff that seems pretty innocuous? Again, back to what's the national security problem that might arise there?
So there are basically two that have been identified. The ones you talked about, Tom, which is basically covert manipulation of content, and we'll drill down to that in a second, as well as some kind of inappropriate theft or use of the data about American users. And we're talking about a lot of American users. There's 170 million Americans on average every month. That's almost about one out of every two Americans use TikTok. And TikTok as an app is right up there, along with some of the other big social media platforms, as being massive vacuums of data about your contact lists, your location, what else you're doing on the web. I'm not saying all of that is always collected, but there's the potential for that depending upon how you, what settings you use and how careful you are about privacy. But there's no question that the app definitely collects a huge amount of data. TikTok says that they do not send that data to Beijing, and they even proposed and currently arrange for Americans' data to be housed in the Oracle cloud in the United States and in Singapore, not in China. So that risk is there. It's a potential. It's not totally clear exactly what China would do with all that data. One can imagine putting it to use in some ways. But I think the far greater risk, the more nefarious risk, is that of covert influence by the CCP of content. And let's just take an example of how this might play out in the real world. Let's assume that President Xi decides he wants to invade Taiwan next year. And in order to do that, he wants to weaken American will about assisting Taiwan, and sow doubts about whether it makes sense for Americans to basically risk their lives defending Taiwan. So one way to do that might be to start using TikTok as a vehicle to sow doubts about the Taiwanese democracy. Maybe it's really corrupt. It doesn't really deserve our attention. By the way, China has a historical basis for acquiring Taiwan anyway, and so on and so forth. And you can see seeds of doubt and seeds of uncertainty being planted, perhaps in a way that isn't all that obvious, just by manipulating content. And that's exactly what people are worried about. Would that in fact occur? I don't know. There's a potential for it. Would we catch it? Maybe, probably at some point, yes, because we've got people doing research in this area, but maybe the damage is done. Who knows? So that's the concern. You can envision other situations in which content could be manipulated in favor of a candidate in an election, et cetera. And as a general matter, we Americans don't want foreigners influencing our public debate. We've already got enough dissension as it is without the help of foreigners.
Right, right. Okay. So I think I'm right, but we'll find out in a moment that you're not having, despite all the concerns and risks you've outlined, you're not a big fan of the law, of the ban as structured. Talk a little bit. What are the issues? What's wrong with the law in your view?
Well, the statute was adopted without specific hearings and specific details about the exact remedy that's proposed, which is to say to ByteDance, you have to sell TikTok within 9 months or you're banned. That particular solution wasn't really addressed in detail either in hearings or in public debate. So Congress passed it in part because I think many members of Congress thought they were worried about the national security risk. No one wants to look soft on China, so to speak. So it was enacted. I don't think it's the smartest way to deal with the problem, but let me be clear. I definitely agree there's a problem. I'm not saying we shouldn't address the problem, but unfortunately, Congress waited until the app became wildly popular. It is the most popular app on the internet, or was the fastest growing app on the internet when it started in 2016 through 2017, 18, 19, et cetera. It's got 2 billion users around the world. 170 million Americans use it, including, I might add, the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign, and arms of the federal government and state government use it to convey useful information, including right now about California wildfires, for example. So there's no question the app is useful. Yes, it also presents a risk. There probably were earlier on better ways of addressing it up front before it got to this point. And now that it's at this point, we're faced with the ugly solution of taking away a social media app and something that's used by many creators. And it arguably affects their free speech rights. I get the opposing arguments. I'm just simply saying it's a suboptimal solution and one that we could have avoided.
What's, just to play devil's advocate a little bit, what is wrong with saying, hey, we have no First Amendment issue, we have no issue with the content. This is about the ownership, and it's owned by a company that technically must, acts at the behest of the Chinese government or must report back. So divest, sell it. What's wrong with that?
So the reality is that the burden of that, although that's the statute operates at the corporate structure level, the reality is, the practical real world reality is that the burden of that falls on TikTok and its platform itself. Yes, you could say, oh, just change your corporate structure and everything will be fine. You can continue business as is. We're not talking about the content. And that, by the way, is essentially what the Solicitor General of the United States argued this morning in the Supreme Court. And there's some merit to that. I'm not saying that's an irrational position at all. But the reality is that in the First Amendment area, we want to look very, very carefully at not the form of the restriction, but its actual effect. And in this case, the effect is essentially to remove this particular platform. It's not realistic to think either that a sale was going to occur without the algorithm, or that the app itself would be useful in just the US operation, because TikTok US alone isn't really worth very much, because the other 1.6 or 7 billion users outside the United States want US content, and the people in the United States want to be able to reach overseas the other 2 billion users.
Mm.
So the reality is, just as a practical matter, when you get down to it, this particular corporate structure ban actually has an effect on the platform. And the platform is content. I mean, one of the things about social media, unlike publications of books or newspapers or magazines, is it's a little hard to separate the platform from content. I mean, there's a reason people are on X. There's a reason people are on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or whatever, because they like the way the platform serves them contents, curates it, handles it, disseminates it. And so the content is inextricably woven into the platform itself. You just can't say, oh, we're not touching the content. And the fact of the matter is, final point, I know it's a long answer here,
Yeah.
but this doesn't really address the concern that the federal government has said, which is the federal government has said, oh, we're not addressing content, we're only addressing corporate structure. But then they totally admit that the reason we're doing this is because we're worried about covert Chinese manipulation of content. So it is content-based. I mean, I don't think there's any way of getting around that. I think the Supreme Court hearing this morning made that pretty clear. And so if it is content-based, we've got to tread very carefully.
But just, I may be missing something here, but and it also may be that it's a pipe dream to imagine this sale happening or the divestment. But if tomorrow ByteDance sold to Disney, then the platform is still the platform, the content is still the content, and this is all taken care of from
statute, right? Solved, correct.
Okay.
So yes, the statute would be met by a sale to a non-foreign adversary. That could be a United Kingdom company, it could be an American company, whatever. Interestingly enough, covert Chinese manipulation could still occur. I mean, that could occur on Facebook, as American as can be, et cetera. So we're not stopping that. That's one of the reasons why I said the statute's not ideal. It doesn't really solve the problem. And by the way, if the platform is banned here in the United States and continues elsewhere around the world, you can get a VPN in 2 seconds and access it elsewhere. So we haven't really solved the problem that way. That's my point of why this is not an ideal solution to what I admit is a genuine risk.
Right. So to get close to the end here, you've said not ideal, you said suboptimal. Talk a little bit, Glenn, about what you think might be closer to optimal or ideal ways to deal with this. I was interested, you've mentioned the ways in which we safeguard our food supply, the ways in which we can take care of electrical appliances and risks they may pose if they come from China. Either with those models or other, what are some ways that you think would be better to address this issue?
Sure, Tom. So just to take a step back for a second, the reason the parties were struggling in the Supreme Court with very tough questions for both sides is because we all recognize that we don't have a really integrated, coherent way of dealing with the risks posed by technology from China. We're perfectly happy to accept all the rewards of that, which is cheap products, products that by and large tend to work and have become pervasive, whether it's DJI drones or TP-Link routers or what have you. We're very happy to use Chinese technology, but it also carries this surveillance risk. We don't have a comprehensive, integrated way of dealing with that. I wish Congress would come up with a solution, to your point, of an integrated way of addressing the risks of Chinese technology. Maybe we need some kind of certification program. Maybe we need some kind of, so to speak, old-fashioned good housekeeping seal of approval on products or apps that say this isn't subject to surveillance regimes by China or data theft or whatever. But we've got to come up with a more thoughtful way, not just playing whack-a-mole and we're banning Huawei equipment one day or DJI drones another day, or maybe this particular app. What about all the data that Temu and Shein, the two big Chinese shopping apps? What about all the data that they collect from tens of millions of Americans? So we're just dealing with this in a very piecemeal, non-integrated way, and that's what I think is up to Congress to do. And that's going to be a really big issue for the next decade.
Yeah. Last question then, Glenn Gerstell. We've heard the arguments. Well, we haven't, seen or heard everything, but where do you think the court is headed, and where do you think this issue is headed? You think the statute is going to become law?
Hard to say. Today's hearing produced tough questions from the 9 justices for both sides, both the government and TikTok. I'd have to say right now that TikTok is facing an uphill battle. I mean, the reality is that there have been 2 lower court decisions that went completely against them. They've got a Supreme Court that is, by and large, willing to defer to the executive on questions of national security, which clearly this is. The statute on its face doesn't necessarily directly implicate the First Amendment. You have to make that argument that I just made before, which TikTok has made. So I'd say TikTok has an uphill fight. Having said that, the justices are, aware of the First Amendment implications. They're going to tread very carefully here. It's possible they might decide before January 19th and issue a substantive opinion. I'm not so sure I'd put a lot of odds on that. This is a very complex area. Maybe they kick the can down the road and send the case to the lower courts, or maybe they just issue a stay and consider the matter later on in 2025, during which time President Trump and the new Congress can figure out another solution to this. Trump has said he wants to figure out a better solution. So we'll see. I'm afraid I'd have to end up with saying, as to what the court's going to do, it's just a question mark at this point.
No, appreciate your honesty and appreciate all your insights. Glenn Gerstell, thank you so much for joining us at the Cipher Brief.
Thank you.
I am candidly not a TikTok user, but it's
Nor am I.
fascinating nonetheless. Yeah.
Nor am I. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks for being with us.